New Orleans, the Velvet Crown Bar. 11:45 at night. She was nobody, a pregnant janitor, head down, invisible among the dangerous men. Ethan Blackwood froze. He set his glass down slowly. Gardenia, warm cedar. His dead wife's perfume. He crossed the room in 4 strides and dropped to his knees on the barroom floor. "I don't know you," her voice barely held. Both hands flew to her stomach. "Please, I don't know that name." His jaw tightened. His eyes found the scar above her brow, the freckles her face. His voice broke on one word. Vivienne. She had no memory of him. No idea who she really was. And the man who made sure of that, he was still watching. This is where the truth begins to surface. If this story already has you, hit like, subscribe, and don't go anywhere. You're going to want to see how this ends. The Velvet Crown had a stage. Nobody used it anymore. A piano, a bass, a drum kit, 3 microphone stands, all of it sitting under cloth covers in the corner. Roped off with a length of velvet like a crime scene nobody was allowed to touch. 8 months ago, the bands played 4 nights a week. She used to book them herself. She had a notebook, handwritten, full of names and numbers and little notes about which bass player showed up late and which one never did. Now the stage just sat there, like everything else in this bar. It was waiting for something that wasn't coming back. Ethan Blackwood walked in at 11:45. The room changed before he even reached the bar. Conversations dropped to half volume. A glass was set down slowly. 2 men near the back entrance straightened up without thinking about it. That's how it worked with him. The room adjusted. The room always adjusted. He poured his own bourbon Blanton's. Private shelf. Nobody else touched it, and sat. His suit probably cost more than most people's rent. He hadn't eaten since morning. Nobody mentioned it. Connor Wade stood 2 steps behind him. Same as always, 11 years of standing 2 steps behind this man. Connor had watched him before the grief and after it. And the difference was not something you got used to. A new guard named Perry was watching from near the door. "Don't stare," Connor said quietly. "What happened to him?" Perry asked. Connor was quiet for a moment. 8 months ago, he said. "This man remembered your mother's name. Asked after her at Christmas. Used to bring food from his wife's cooking for the overnight guys." He looked at Ethan at the bar, alone in a room full of people. "Grief doesn't make you soft. People get that wrong. It burns out everything that was holding the hard parts back. What you're looking at right now, that's what's left when the good stuff goes first." Perry didn't ask anything else. Marcus Webb arrived at 11:52. He had a leather portfolio and a takeout container from a restaurant on Prytania Street. He set the food in front of Ethan without comment. Ethan didn't open it. Marcus sat down across from him and got to work shipping manifests. A senator's name circled in red. A problem that needed a decision. Harlow's getting nervous about the Gulf contracts. He wants more money. He wants to feel like he has leverage. "Give him the feeling," Ethan said. "Not the leverage." Marcus tried a different angle after that. Softer, warmer. The voice of a man who grew up on the same block. "Who knew you before all of this?" "Ethan, when's the last time you slept? More than 3 hours." Ethan looked at him, just looked. Marcus closed the portfolio. Out in the alley, a woman was checking her bag before her shift. Thin wallet, a shelter meal card, folded twice, an extra pair of gloves, and a small glass bottle with no label. The stopper worn smooth from handling. Barely a quarter full. She'd found it in the pocket of the clothes she was wearing when she woke up at the clinic in Gary, Indiana. No name, no ID, no memory of any life before that fluorescent ceiling. She didn't know what the perfume was. She didn't know where it came from. She only knew that when she opened it, gardenia and warm cedar, it was the only thing in her life that felt like it had always been hers. She dabbed a little to her wrist, put it back, shouldered her bag. She did this every night before work. She didn't know why. Her name was Ellie. The clinic gave it to her because she had to be called something. She came through the service door in an oversized navy jumpsuit that couldn't hide the 7-month belly anymore. Worn rubber shoes, a knit cap pulled low. She moved carefully, not shy, not frightened, just like someone who had learned, over 8 months of being nobody, that taking up less space kept things simpler. Dee Crawford was waiting at the door with a foil-wrapped plate. Dee was the bar manager. 58 years old, Ninth Ward born. Had worked for the Blackwood family longer than Ellie had been alive. She did not give everyone a plate. She wanted that understood. "Eat before you start." "I need you conscious. You don't have to keep doing this," Ellie said. "I know I don't." That was the whole conversation. Ellie had started coming to this block 3 months after she got to shelter on Britannia Street. She didn't plan it. Couldn't explain it. She'd walk in the evenings when she couldn't sleep, which was most evenings, and she'd end up here, standing across from this building, feeling something she didn't have a word for. Not a memory, something older than that. Like a compass needle that had been pointing at the same thing her whole life and just hadn't told her yet. 6 times she'd stood on that sidewalk before Dee found her there one night in the rain. "You all right? I don't know," Ellie said. "I just keep ending up here." Dee looked at her for a long moment. Then, "I need someone for the night shift who won't ask questions." "You interested?" She said yes. She still didn't know why she kept coming back. She'd stopped trying to figure it out. At 12:30, she was mopping the hallway near the main room when she saw the photographs. A whole wall of them. Charity events, private parties. 10 years of things that happened in this building. All of them facing out. All of them except one near the end of the hall, turned face to wall. Ellie reached out and turned it around. A couple at a gala, the man in a dark suit, the woman in green, laughing. Her head tilted toward his like she'd forgotten anyone else was in the room. Something moved in Ellie's chest. Not recognition, something underneath recognition. She looked at it for 3 seconds, turned away. Kept mopping, did not look back. In the main room, Ethan put down his fourth glass too hard. The sound cracked through the air. Perry flinched, shifted his elbow, caught the edge of a service cart. A full bottle of bourbon hit the hardwood floor and shattered. The room went completely still. "I'll send the girl," Dee said from the doorway. Ellie came out with her dustpan and broom. Eyes down, moving through the seated men like a person who had learned to be invisible. She made it to the wall, knelt down, started sweeping. And Ethan Blackwood stopped breathing. It came from nowhere, under the bourbon. Under the smoke, something faint. Something specific. Something that had no business being in this room. Gardenia. Warm cedar, a perfume made by one woman, at one shop at her specific request. He'd been standing beside her when she ordered it. He remembered the perfumer writing down the formula. He had not smelled it since October. His eyes moved to the woman kneeling on the floor. Her back was to him, the curve of her neck. The way her left shoulder sat higher than her right. He stood up, the chair scraped back. Every person in the room heard it. Ellie turned her head, just slightly, just enough for the light to catch the left side of her face, the small scar above her eyebrow, the freckles across her nose. The exact face that had been in every dream he'd had for 8 months. Ethan Blackwood made a sound. It wasn't a word, it wasn't a command. It was the sound a man makes when he's been underwater a very long time, and he has just broken the surface. He was looking at her the way no stranger had the right to look at anyone, like she was the answer to a question that had been eating him alive. Ethan Blackwood crossed the room in 4 strides and dropped to his knees in front of her. Just like that. The most feared man in New Orleans. On his knees on a barroom floor. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Marcus froze mid-sentence. Connor took 1 step forward and stopped. His face was completely open. That was the frightening part. Not the size of him. Not the way the room had gone silent. It was his face. The controlled surface that usually covered everything was just gone. Stripped off. And what was underneath it was something raw and desperate and about 8 months old. He said her name, Vivienne. Ellie didn't know that name. She knew that much for certain. She also knew what she saw. A large man, visibly drunk, who had just crossed a room full of armed people to kneel in front of a pregnant stranger and say a dead woman's name like a prayer. Every instinct she had fired at once. She scrambled backward. Her shoes hit the wet floor wrong and slipped, and she went into the wall hard. One hand flying up to protect her stomach. The baby kicked. Sharp and startled, her vision went white at the edges. Ethan reached for her, both hands, closing around her upper arms. Not rough, but not gentle either. "The grip of a man grabbing something he believes will disappear," she cried out. Ethan Marcus was there, hand on Ethan's shoulder, voice low and even. "Let go of her. Look at her. She's pregnant and she's terrified. Let go of her right now." His voice was calm, reasonable, exactly right. Dee Crawford pushed through from the kitchen doorway. "Mr. Blackwood, her name is Ellie. She's a resident at the St. Anne's shelter on Britannia Street. She had an accident 8 months ago. A serious accident. She has amnesia, sir. She does not know who she is. She is not who you think she is." The room was very quiet. Ethan released her. He sat back on his heels and looked at her face. Really looked. the scar above her left eyebrow, thin and curved from a bicycle accident at age 7 that Vivienne always covered with her hair, the freckles across the bridge of her nose, the line of her jaw. He looked at her stomach. He did math. She watched him do it. She watched something happen behind his eyes that she couldn't name. She looked around the room. Armed men at every door, no ID, no last name anyone would recognize. No one to call. She was 7 months pregnant and physically worn down from 8 months of not enough food and not enough sleep, sitting on the floor of a private bar with no public entrance. Surrounded by people who answered to the man currently on his knees staring at her like she was something he'd lost. She had nothing. Not one card to play. She tried the only thing she had left. "Please," she said. "I don't know what's happening. I don't know you. I don't know that name. I'm not going to tell anyone anything. I have nothing to tell. Please just let me leave." Ethan stood up slowly. His face reassembled itself. The grief went back under the surface. What replaced it was something quieter. Something flat and absolute. "You're not leaving. Not a threat. Just a fact. The way you'd say the floor is solid or the door is locked." Like a law of physics, Ellie began to cry. She didn't want to. She did it quietly, carefully, because she had learned that crying was information, and she couldn't afford to give any away. She raised her head anyway. She looked at him and every man in that room, and she said it clearly, without shaking, without drama. "I don't care who you think I am. I am a person. A pregnant person who is frightened. Whatever you believe about me. Whatever claim you think you have. None of that changes what I am. I am a human being with rights. That is true in here the same as anywhere else. And I need you to hear that." Nobody spoke. Connor looked at the floor. Marcus's face did something controlled and careful that was not quite discomfort. Ethan stared at her. She meant every word, and the room knew it. And for just a moment that was enough to make even this room go still. Then Ethan looked at Connor. "Car," he looked at the ceilings, "my estate." Now he didn't look at Marcus. Ellie didn't notice that. Not yet. She fainted before anyone had to make a decision about moving her. It wasn't dramatic. Her blood pressure had been dropping since the moment she hit the wall, and she'd been holding herself upright through will alone. The will just ran out. She went down and Ethan caught her before she reached the floor. He carried her out the back. She was too light, even pregnant. She was too light. He buckled her into the armored car with hands that weren't steady, and he didn't say anything. Marcus caught him at the car door. 30 seconds, low voice. The voice of a lifelong friend. "Listen to me. The Delacroix family has been circling our port contracts for 2 months. If someone planted her here to get inside your head, walking out with her is exactly what they want. She could be anyone, Ethan." Ethan looked at him, held it for just a moment. "Then we'll find out," he said. He got in the car, in the front seat. Connor heard something from the back. A murmur, barely there. He leaned back to listen. Room 7, eyes closed. Head against the glass, at the shelter. Under the floorboard, there's a box. "If something happens to me." Connor wrote it down. He didn't tell Ethan. Not yet. He had his own reasons for waiting. The estate gates opened, iron and old stone. Lit from the ground, Ellie opened her eyes. She looked through the glass at the building. Something happened. Not memory. Not recognition. Something in the body. Lower and older than either of those things. A pull. Like the same thing that had walked her to that neighborhood 6 times in 3 months without explanation. Without intention. She had been here before. She closed her eyes before she had to decide what that meant. A prison doesn't stop being a prison because the sheets cost $800. Dr. Patricia Reyes arrived at the estate 40 minutes after they did, which was 40 minutes faster than it should have been possible. She came in through the side entrance with a medical bag and the expression of a woman who had been making compromises for a long time and was very good at not thinking about most of them. She examined Ellie in the master suite, took her blood pressure, checked the baby's heartbeat, asked questions in a calm professional voice that expected calm professional answers. She noted everything. The baby was strong, surprisingly so for a woman whose nutritional status told a rough 8-month story. Reyes wrote things down without commenting on them. She spoke to Ethan in the hallway. "The amnesia is genuine," she said. Her voice didn't soften for his rank. It never had. The records from the Gary Clinic confirm a brain injury consistent with blast shockwave exposure.
Severe.
Her brain closed off access to the past as a protective response. It may come back gradually. It may not come back at all. I can't predict it, neither what do I do, nothing. You let her lead, you give her safety. Not pressure. You do not tell her who she is before she's ready. If you overwhelm her before her mind is ready to hold it, you risk a dissociative break she may not come back from. Ethan absorbed that. And the baby, health-strong. Reyes paused. She's been keeping that baby alive on almost nothing for 7 months. Whatever else she is, with or without her memory, that woman has been fighting. He was quiet. I need to say something else, Reyes said, and I need you to hear it without arguing. Say it. That woman in there came into this building as a person. She was frightened. She was carrying a child. She had no power in that room, and everyone knew it. You brought her here, and you locked that door. She held his eyes. I'm choosing to believe your intentions aren't malicious. But the effect is the same as what was already done to her. Someone decided 8 months ago that her existence was inconvenient. They erased her. If you keep her here without her consent, you're doing the same thing with better intentions. She doesn't belong to you because she looks like someone who did, Ethan said. She's carrying my child, your child, Reyes said. Her body. Those are not the same sentence. She went back inside. Ethan stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went downstairs and sat in his office in the dark and didn't do anything for a while. Upstairs, Ellie lay in the center of a bed that probably cost more than a year of her shelter stipend, staring at the ceiling of a room she didn't recognize. Listening to a house she didn't know, she was tired enough to sleep for a week. She didn't sleep at all. In the morning, Ethan knocked. He'd changed out of the suit, dark slacks, a plain shirt. He looked smaller without the armor of the expensive clothes. Just a tired man who hadn't slept properly in a long time and was aware of it. He sat in the chair across from the bed. He didn't move toward her. My name is Ethan. This is my property. I'm not going to hurt you. Ellie said, you lock the door. He looked at her. Then he stood up, crossed the room, unlocked the door, and came back and sat down. The door stayed open. She studied him. She hadn't asked him to do that. It had been a statement of fact, not a request, and he'd just done it. She filed that away, the woman's name. Vivienne. Who was she? My wife. You think I'm her. I know you are. Your friend in the bar said I might be a trap someone set for you. She watched his face. So which is it? Am I your dead wife or am I a weapon somebody pointed at you? He went very still. You were conscious enough to hear that. I was not fully unconscious. He looked at her for a long time. I'm going to find out. Until I do, I need you somewhere safe. This is the safest place in New Orleans. Ellie looked at her hands on her stomach. She thought about it honestly. The way she thought about everything now. Because she had nothing to lose by being honest with herself. If I'm going to stay here, she said, and I'm not committing to that. I have terms, tell me. My name is Ellie until I decide otherwise. I choose what I eat. I walk the grounds when I want. I have access to a phone. He didn't negotiate, didn't qualify. Didn't take time to think it over. Agreed. She looked at him. He just said agreed, just like that. A man who ran a criminal operation out of a private jazz club and had armed men at every door just agreed, without arguing, to the terms of a pregnant woman with no money and no name. She didn't trust it yet, but she filed it away next to the unlocked door. 2 days later, when Ethan was downstairs and the house was quiet, she explored. The master suite had a walk-in closet. His side was organized with the precision of someone who controlled things for a living. Dark suits, all facing the same direction. Shirts arranged by color. Everything in its place, the other side hadn't been touched. Dresses, several of them in a particular shade of green. Scarves folded over a rack, a shelf of perfume bottles. All different shapes, and one of them almost empty. She picked it up and opened it, gardenia and warm cedar. Identical to the bottle in her bag. The one she'd found in her pocket when she woke up in Gary. The one she'd been carrying for 8 months, because it was the only thing that felt like it belonged to her. Her knees considered giving out. She held the shelf until they decided not to. Pearl drop earrings on the dresser. Small, simple, sitting there like they'd been set down a minute ago. A wedding ring. Gold band, plain, with an engraving on the inside. She held it to the light and read it. You were always the brave one. She sat down on the floor of the closet. She didn't cry. She was too many things at once to cry. She was in a dead woman's room. She had a dead woman's face and a dead woman's smell, and she was carrying a dead woman's baby. And she could not reach a single memory. Not one thread that would tell her whether she was that woman or whether some particular cruelty of the universe had simply made two people who looked exactly alike. Her own mind was the cage. She could see the door, she couldn't find the handle. She put the ring back exactly where it was. She was about to stand up when she noticed the cedar chest, old heavy, sitting against the far wall. She pushed it a few inches. Under the front left corner, a floorboard moved underneath it, wrapped in a square of dark cloth, was a journal. The handwriting inside was neat and expressive, and slant slightly left. August 14th. Marcus asked me today, for the third time this month, why I spend so much time at the Magazine Street shelter. I told him I like it there. He looked at me like I'd made a mathematical error. I told Ethan about it tonight. He laughed. I'm writing it down anyway. September 2nd. I told Ethan tonight that I want to start transitioning the estate holdings toward legitimate operations. Not all at once, a 5-year plan. He got quiet. Then he said he'd think about it. That's the furthest I've gotten in 2 years of asking. I love him. But sometimes loving someone means refusing to let them stay who they are. She turned to the last entry. October 11th, 3 days before the car bomb. Something is wrong, I can't name it, and I've tried. I feel watched from inside the house, not outside it, if something happens to me. And I'm not being dramatic. I'm being precise. Start with the people who were most afraid of what Ethan was becoming. Not what he is, what he was becoming. Ellie held the journal against her chest. She looked at the ceiling. Who were you? She said quietly. She wasn't sure who she was talking to. For the first time since Gary. Since the clinic ceiling and the empty name and the fog where her life should have been. She felt something other than fear, something specific and clean. Grief for a stranger she already missed. Footsteps in the hall. She shoved the journal under her pillow, sat up, tried to look like someone who'd just been resting. Connor Wade appeared in the doorway with a dinner tray. He set it on the side table without being asked. On his way out, he paused. His eyes went to the pillow, then back to her face. He said nothing. He left. He knew about the journal. He'd known since the moment Vivian hid it. He'd been waiting for 8 months for someone to find it. The most dangerous lie Marcus Webb ever told was the one he told with his eyes. The look that said, I am the only one who has never betrayed you. Ethan started working the problem the morning after. He pulled surveillance footage from the night of the bombing. He contacted people in Gary, Indiana, who owed him answers. He requested Vivian's dental records through a contact at Tulane Medical Center, specifically not through Gerald Haynes, because Ethan was beginning, for the first time, to have a reason to wonder about Gerald Haynes. Connor brought him the results 36 hours later. The dental records Haynes filed with the county examiner's office, Connor said. They weren't hers. Ethan looked up from his desk. They belonged to a Jane Doe. Woman, unclaimed, county morgue for 11 weeks before the bombing. Similar height, similar build. Connor set the file down. Someone with access to the medical examiner's systems and the police forensics database swapped them. The window was 48 hours after the bombing, during the investigation chaos, when nobody was watching the paperwork too closely. Who had that access officially? Haynes, his deputy, and a forensics contractor. Unofficially, whoever paid one of those three. Ethan was quiet, find the money, that same morning across town. Marcus Webb was standing at his kitchen counter at 7:15 with a cup of coffee and a burner phone. He was reading a text, one line. She's still at the estate. He set the phone down. He sipped the coffee. He didn't look troubled. He looked like a man reviewing a status update on a project that had hit a minor delay. Something within parameters. Something manageable. He opened his closet. He chose his suit for the day with the same calm attention he gave everything. He checked his reflection. He straightened his collar. He was not a man in crisis. He was a man whose plan had encountered friction, the way all plans did, and who was now adjusting. That was all this was, an adjustment. That was what made him terrifying. Not the violence, the calm, the absolute, untroubled calm of a man who believed, completely, that he was right. He came to the estate at noon, presenting it as a welfare check on an old friend. Ellie watched him from the upstairs landing. She'd heard his car arrive. She'd come to the railing without quite deciding to. Now she stood above the main hall and watched Marcus Webb shake Ethan's hand and put an arm around his shoulder and speak in the warm, measured tones of a man performing lifelong friendship. The baby kicked, twice. Ellie put her hand on her stomach. She watched Marcus laugh at something Ethan said. The laugh was perfect. It had exactly the right sound, the exact right shape. The eyes didn't change at all. She went back to the room. She opened Vivian's journal and wrote in the margin, "Small and careful, the man called Marcus. The laugh doesn't reach the eyes. Watch the eyes." She put the journal back under the pillow. She sat on the bed and thought about what it meant to notice a thing and not know yet what to do with it. For Ellie, that was a familiar feeling. She'd been noticing things for 8 months with no framework to put them in. You learn to hold what you noticed, carefully, like something that might still be useful later. She was getting good at holding things carefully. The quiet days that followed were strange in a way she hadn't expected. Ethan followed Dr. Reyes's instructions. She could see the effort in it, the deliberateness. Like a man operating a machine he hadn't used before and was committed to not breaking. He didn't pressure her. He didn't call her Vivian. Food appeared from a restaurant on Magazine Street that she kept wanting to order from before she knew how she knew to want it. He never explained why he chose that one. Books appeared on the nightstand. Art history, and she read them with a fluency that suggested something deeper than interest. She didn't mention that either. One evening she heard jazz from the sitting room. Old recordings. She was walking past with a cup of tea, and her foot moved before her brain caught up with it. She stopped. She stood outside the door and listened. The baby went still in a way that felt almost like listening, too. She went in without being invited and sat down in the chair across from him. They didn't speak. They listened to the whole record. When it ended, he turned to say something, and she was asleep. Head tilted back, one hand resting on her stomach. He covered her with a blanket. He sat across from her until morning. She started to believe the estate was safe. That was her first mistake. It was a Tuesday morning when the contractions started. Real ones. Not the practice tightening she'd felt occasionally over the past few weeks. These were irregular and sharp and wrong. And she knew immediately they were wrong, even without knowing exactly how she knew. 30 weeks. Too early. Dr. Reyes arrived in 20 minutes. The verdict was stress-induced preterm labor, IV fluids, medication to slow the contractions, hospital monitoring, private wing, assumed name. Ethan spent 4 hours in a 12-foot stretch of hallway, back and forth. Back, forth. He didn't pray. He'd never been a man who prayed. He just walked the 12 feet and turned and walked it back, over and over, like the movement itself was doing something. Inside the room, Reyes sat beside Ellie while the monitors ran. "The baby is stable, but I want you to hear this from me directly. The level of sustained stress you're carrying is not compatible with a good outcome if it continues. You need to find something to anchor yourself to. How do I anchor myself when I don't know who I am?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. "You know who the baby is. Start there." Ellie thought about that for a long time. It wasn't nothing. That was the thing. It felt like nothing, but it wasn't. The baby was real. The baby was the most real thing in her life. Everything else was fog, but the baby was solid and present and hers. The contractions slowed, then spaced out. By the 4th hour, the readings had stabilized, and Reyes came out of the room and told Ethan without preamble that they were both okay, and he could stop walking now. He stopped walking. He stood still for a moment, like a man who'd forgotten how. They left the hospital at 3 in the afternoon. Connor was in the front seat. He saw the car as they were pulling out of the private exit, black SUV, street-level parking across from the main entrance. Present when they arrived and repositioned now. Man in the passenger seat with a long lens camera, trying to look like he wasn't. Connor ran the plate in the car. The registration came back to a shell company. He recognized the name. He'd seen it once before. 18 months ago on a logistics file from a job Marcus had run. He told Ethan in 3-word intervals, quietly, so Ellie wouldn't track the conversation. Ethan's face didn't move. That was the telling thing with him. When he was merely angry, his face showed it. When he arrived somewhere past anger, past the place where expression was useful, his face went flat and still in a way that was much worse. That was the face he was wearing now. That night, he went to his private office and sat in the dark for a moment. He opened the desk drawer. He took out a photograph. Him and Marcus at the wedding, arms around each other, both of them grinning. The specific grin of 2 men who had been through enough together to believe nothing could change what they were to each other. He looked at it for a long time. He put it face down in the drawer. He picked up the phone. The person answered on the second ring. "Gerald Haynes," Ethan said. "Find him tonight." He hung up. He sat there a while longer. He thought about a journal he hadn't known existed, hidden under a floorboard in a room he'd left untouched for 8 months. He thought about a woman who had been frightened enough, 8 months before she died, to write down what she noticed. He thought about what she'd written. Start with the people who were most afraid of what Ethan was becoming. He'd laughed when she told him about Marcus asking questions. He'd laughed. He'd told her she was reading into things. He'd told her Marcus was just protective. That was just how he was. That she didn't understand how the business worked. She understood exactly how the business worked. She just understood something else too. Something Ethan hadn't been ready to hear. He turned off the light. He went upstairs. He stopped in the hallway outside her door. The door was open, the way he'd left it, the way it stayed now. He could see her in the bed from the doorway. She was sleeping. Her hand was on her stomach even in sleep. Always there, always keeping watch. He stood there for a moment. She had said, "I am a human being with rights." That is true in here the same as anywhere else. She'd said that to a room full of his people. 7 months pregnant and alone and completely without power. And she'd said it clearly and without shaking. He'd been doing this for 20 years. He'd been in rooms with men who had everything, and men who had nothing, and every kind of man in between. He had never heard anyone say a true thing that cleanly. He went to his room. He did not sleep. He stared at the ceiling and thought about a lot of things he'd been not thinking about for a very long time. In the morning, the photograph was still face down in the drawer. He left it that way. She had spent 8 months believing that finding out who she was would fix everything. She was wrong. Finding out and feeling nothing was the cruelest outcome of all. Connor knocked on her door at 10 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had decided to do something difficult and was going to do it before he talked himself out of it. She let him in. He sat across from her and looked at his hands for a moment, not fidgeting, just looking. The way people do when they're deciding where to start. "There's something I should have said a long time ago," he said, to her, to Vivian. "Ellie didn't move. About 6 weeks before the bombing, I noticed a car, parked where it had no reason to be. 3 times in 1 week, same car, same spot, different times of day." He paused. "I didn't know what it meant. I filed it away and I moved on. Told myself it was probably nothing." He looked up. "That was a mistake. If I had pushed on it, if I had said something, she might not have been in that car." Ellie was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me?" "Because she trusted the people around her," Connor said. "Most of them let her down. I was one of them. I'm not going to do that again." He didn't ask her to forgive him. He didn't make it about himself. He just set it down like something he'd been carrying that he wanted her to know the weight of. She respected that. Gerald Haynes was found at a vacation property outside Biloxi that same afternoon. Connor told her later he hadn't needed much persuasion. He'd been a man waiting for a knock at the door for 8 months. When it finally came, the confession came with it. The switch, a woman from Cook County morgue, unclaimed, unidentified, close enough in height and build. The forgery, dental records swapped in the police database 47 hours after the bombing. During the investigation chaos, when no one was watching the filing systems too carefully. The abduction, Marcus's men had been there, dressed as paramedics. Vivian had stepped around the back of the car to pick up an earring, the pearl drop one, same one still sitting on the dresser upstairs. The blast knocked her out but didn't catch her in the main zone. She was taken to a private clinic outside Gary. Instructions were to keep her sedated until further arrangements could be made. She woke up in the night before those arrangements were completed. She ran $1.8 million, 3 offshore accounts. A Senate finance PAC registered to a man named Richard Harlow, and the name that authorized all of it, Marcus Webb. Connor said it quietly, standing in the doorway of Ethan's office. She survived him twice, and she didn't know she was surviving either time. Ethan didn't respond. He just sat there. Then he went upstairs to talk to Ellie. He brought everything. He laid it out slowly on the bed in front of her, piece by piece, the way you'd present evidence. Because that's what it was. Wedding photographs, medical records with a DNA comparison. Hair from the closet brush, matched against blood Reyes had drawn during the hospital visit. 99.97% concordance, the dental record comparison. A stack of sticky notes in her own handwriting from the back of his desk drawer. The notes she used to leave on his office door when she was too angry to speak out loud. Because she believed words said in anger weren't worth the air they cost. He talked for 40 minutes. Their 4 years of marriage. Her work at the Magazine Street shelter. The proposal at midnight in a cemetery because she'd said once that she found cemeteries peaceful and he'd actually listened. 2 years of trying to have a baby. The way she argued with a legal pad and a specific patient's certainty. Like someone who knew they were right and was prepared to wait however long it took for you to catch up. He showed her everything. His voice stayed even, his hands shook the entire time. Ellie held the wedding photograph for a long time. She touched the woman's face, her own face, radiant, completely unfamiliar. She read the sticky notes in handwriting she didn't recognize as hers. She picked up the wedding ring and read the inscription again. You were always the brave one. Ishi set it down. She looked at him. I believe you, she said, all of it. The DNA, the photographs, the records. I believe this is me. She paused, and I feel nothing. The room was very quiet. I look at her face, and I don't know her. I read her words, and they're not in my voice. I look at you, and I believe you loved her. I can see that you did. I believe it completely. She set the ring down carefully. But I don't know you. I can't love a stranger just because he loved someone who looked like me. Ethan didn't move. I'm not asking you to, he said. His voice barely held the sentence. Then what are you asking? I don't know. First time. First time in the whole conversation. In probably a long time. That Ethan Blackwood did not have an answer. I just need you to be alive. The rest I'll figure out. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said the thing she'd been building toward. I need you to understand something about what was done to me. They didn't just take my memory, they took my name. My choices, my right to exist as a specific person with a specific history. For 8 months, I have been nobody. Not because I did anything wrong, but because one man decided my existence was an inconvenience. She didn't look away from him. That is not something you fix by laying out evidence on a bed. I have to rebuild myself from whatever is left, and I do that on my terms. Not yours, not Marcus Webb's. Mine. Okay, he said. She looked at him. I said okay. He stood up. Your terms, he walked out. The door stayed alone for a while. The door was open. He'd made that clear, made it real, and she could walk through it. She had enough information now. She could go to a shelter, go to the police, go somewhere else and start again. She thought about Marcus Webb, his surveillance car outside the hospital, his men in Gary, a man who had already tried to erase her once and who knew she had survived. She thought about the baby. She stayed. Not for love, not for Ethan. For the baby and for the specific reality of a man still out there who had already demonstrated what he was willing to do. Pragmatic, clear-eyed, not romantic. She called through the open door. Ethan's footsteps stopped in the hallway. He appeared in the frame. I want to walk the grounds tomorrow morning, she said. Will you walk with me? Something changed in his face, small. She couldn't name it yet. Yeah, he said, I'll walk with you. Marcus Webb's greatest skill was not violence. It was precision. Knowing exactly which word, in exactly which tone, would move a person exactly where he needed them to go. The estate grounds in morning light were something else. A century-old live oak grove, massive and permanent, the kind of trees that had been there before anyone alive could remember. A walled garden with a fountain Ellie could hear before she could see it. Roses along the south wall. Herbs along the north, things planted with intention and tended with care. She walked through the garden and didn't consciously recognize a single thing. But her hands knew. She reached out as she passed a rosebush and removed a dead bloom without deciding to. Just reached out and did it. The way you do a thing you've done 1,000 times. Then she looked at her hand. You did that every Sunday. Ethan said. He wasn't pushing. Just answering the question her face was asking. She set the bloom down. They kept walking. She asked him why he ran the club. He told her the truth. It's a front. For other things, she already knew that. Do you want to keep doing it? He walked a few steps before answering. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else. That's not the same answer as yes. He looked at her. No, he said. It's not that afternoon. She heard him go into his office and close the door. She was passing in the hallway an hour later when she noticed it was open again. She glanced in without meaning to. He was standing in front of the large mirror on the wall across from his desk. Just standing there, not doing anything, just looking at himself the way people rarely do. The way that has nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with accounting. She kept walking. She thought about what it meant to see yourself accurately and choose to stay in the room with the view. Most people left. They found something to look at instead, something easier. She'd watched people do it at the shelter, in the clinic. everywhere she'd been in 8 months of being nobody. The ones who couldn't look at what they were never got anywhere different. She didn't know if Ethan would get anywhere different. But he was looking, that was something. Marcus arrived at 2 o'clock. Scheduled business visit. Normal, expected. He came through the front door with his portfolio and his easy warmth and the practiced manner of a man who was exactly as comfortable here as in his own home. Connor pulled Ethan away 10 minutes in, a call from the Gary contact. Something that needed an immediate decision. Ellie was left in the sitting room with Marcus Webb. He poured himself coffee from the service tray on the sideboard. He sat across from her. He looked at her with something that was shaped exactly like sympathy. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Better. Good." He paused the right length of time. "Ethan is a lot. I've known him my whole life, so I can say that. He loves hard, that's his best quality and his most consuming one." Another pause. "I just want you to know, whatever you decide about staying, there are people who could help you. Options. You don't have to be here because he needs you to be." Ellie said. "That's very considerate of you. He's my brother, and a pregnant woman needs to be somewhere she chose, not somewhere she was delivered." He said it warmly, he meant it to sound protective. He was mapping her, she understood that. How attached was she? How much did she trust Ethan? What angle would work if he needed one? She'd been watching this man since chapter 4. She'd written "watch the eyes" in the journal margin. She had a theory and she'd decided this was the moment to test it. She leaned back slightly casual. "Confiding, it's strange," she said. "The clinic in Gary where I was found. They told me they get a lot of people like me. Accident victims. People who end up on Route 12 and can't say how they got there." Marcus nodded. "I've always thought." She continued, "that if I could ever find out what road I was on before Route 12, it might help somehow. The intake records are so incomplete." Marcus looked at her with gentle sympathy. "Well, at least you survived, after something like Lakeshore Drive. Finding yourself in Gary is almost lucky." Ellie let it sit for exactly 3 seconds. "You're right," she said. She smiled. She changed the subject. She asked him something about New Orleans weather. He answered. They talked for 4 more minutes. He left on warm, friendly terms, telling her to take care of herself, that she knew where to reach him if she needed anything. She watched his car pull out of the gate. Then she went to her room and opened the notebook she'd started keeping. She wrote it down carefully. "Lakeshore Drive. He knows where it happened. My clinic intake form says Route 12. The records say Route 12. There is nothing anywhere that says Lakeshore Drive. I never told anyone Lakeshore Drive. Dee doesn't know. The shelter doesn't know. He was there, or someone who was there told him." She circled it 3 times. She held the notebook and thought about Vivienne's journal entry. "I feel watched from inside the house." She thought about what it meant to notice something true and have no one believe you. She thought about what it cost a person to be right about a danger and have the people around them laugh it off. She thought about how ordinary that was. How it happened everywhere, in every size. Women noticing things and being told they were reading into it. Women watching the eyes and being told they were paranoid. The version Vivienne had lived through ended with a car bomb. Most versions ended quieter, but the logic underneath was the same. The belief that a woman's read on a situation mattered less than a man's comfort in dismissing it. She closed the notebook. That evening at dinner she laughed. She didn't plan it. Ethan said something dry and offhand about the estate's ancient dishwasher, and it surprised a laugh out of her before she knew it was coming. He nearly dropped his fork. She noticed, "Have I not laughed before?" "Not since you got here." She showed him the journal after dinner. Sat across the table and slid it toward him and watched him read. He read the last entry twice. "Set it down. She was afraid of someone close to you." Ellie said, "I know." She was right to be. He closed the journal. The fire in the hearth said something that neither of them did for a moment. "I'm going to handle it," he said. "Handle it the way you usually handle things." He met her eyes, a long pause. "Long enough to be real. I haven't decided yet." She thought about that later. Alone in her room, she wrote in her notebook. He said he hasn't decided yet. That's the first honest answer I've heard from someone with power. Not "this is what will happen," just "I don't know yet." Maybe that's what change sounds like before it's loud enough to hear. Connor came to Ethan's office after dinner. He set a printed document on the desk. "The Cayman account," Connor said. "The money that paid Haynes. It wasn't routed directly from Marcus. It went through a Senate finance pack. He waited Senator Richard Harlow. three-term Louisiana senator. He and Marcus have had 14 private meetings in the past year. 3 of them were the week before the bombing. Ethan looked at the document. Marcus is building a replacement, he said. He's been building it for 8 months, using your grief as cover. While you were in that bar drinking yourself into the floor, he was positioning. Ethan sat with that for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Find out everything Harlow knows." The problem with believing you're safe is that you stop watching the perimeter. That is the exact moment the perimeter moves. 5 weeks, that's how long the quiet lasted. 5 weeks of something that felt, cautiously, like ordinary life. Or the closest thing to it that was available in these circumstances. Ethan stopped drinking, no announcement, no conversation about it. The bourbon bottles that had been on the bar in his office just weren't there one morning. She noticed. She didn't say anything. Some things are said better by saying nothing. He came to dinner sober every night. He was present in a way she was starting to recognize. The specific quality of attention someone gives you when they're not managing anything else inside their own head at the same time. He learned things about her without being told. She didn't like cilantro. She slept better with the window cracked an inch. Even in the cool weather. She hummed when she was reading. Low and unconscious, and she never seemed to know she was doing it. He read to her from the art history books in the evenings. The first time was because she was too tired to hold the book herself, and he picked it up and kept going. After that, neither of them suggested stopping. She started calling him E one evening. Not a decision, just what came out. He didn't react. Connor noticed him almost smile in the hallway 2 days later. "Almost, doctor." Reyes came on a Thursday morning, a week before everything changed. She sat with Ellie in the garden while Ethan was inside on calls. "I want to say something and I want you to hear it clearly," Reyes said. "What I'm watching in that house is unusual. A man who built his entire identity around controlling things is learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to follow instead of lead. He's not reformed, he's not finished. He's probably not even close." She paused. "But he is trying, and trying is not nothing. It's the material that either becomes something or doesn't, depending on what comes after." "What's the difference," Ellie asked, "between trying and actually changing?" Reyes thought about it. "Effort says I'm working on it. Accountability says here is what I'm fixing. Here is who I'm answering to. And here is what I accept as fair consequence for what I've done." She looked at her. "He's at effort right now. Effort is where it starts. We'll watch for accountability." Ellie sat with that. She thought about what accountability actually looked like, what it required. It required witnesses. It required consequences that existed outside of a person's own head. It required something beyond private intention and quiet change. Something visible and permanent and on record. She filed that away. She was 32 weeks along now. The baby had dropped slightly. Riding lower, and the weight of it was different. More forward, more constant. She walked slower. She stopped on the garden path sometimes and just stood, hand on her stomach, watching the light in the live oak trees. Those 5 weeks were the closest thing to peace she'd had since Gary. That was the mistake, believing the peace was real. It was a Wednesday evening. Ellie was in the garden at sunset. Ethan was inside on a call. Connor was at the gate checkpoint doing the 6 o'clock walkthrough. She heard the tires on the gravel before she heard anything else. Then the gates. The sound of the iron gates taking the first burst of automatic weapons fire before any alarm had time to go off. She dropped. She didn't decide to, her body decided. The same instinct that had kept her alive through 8 months of nothing. And she was on the grass with her arms around her stomach before she'd processed what the sound was. The baby. Protect the baby. That was the only thought. Connor's voice came through the estate intercom. "Lockdown, all positions." Now, the Delacroix family had wanted the Blackwood port contracts for 5 years. Marcus had given them something better than a plan. He'd given them a window. Ethan distracted, emotionally compromised. Running reduced staff because he'd sent units to Biloxi to find Haynes. The timing was precise, it was a gift. Ethan came out of the house at a run, not toward the gate. Toward the garden, toward her. He reached her and hauled her up in one motion. His body went between her and the main firing line without hesitation, without calculation, without a single second of deciding. He just did it. His arm came around her and he moved. Fast and low. "Stay with me. Don't stop." They were 10 feet from the back door when the second shot came. A gunman at the garden wall. elevated position, the one they hadn't accounted for. It caught Ethan in the left shoulder. She felt him stagger, felt the impact go through his arm around her. He went down to one knee and made no sound at all. He stayed upright, through will alone. He stayed upright. He got her through the door. Then he went down in the hallway, blood spreading fast and dark through his shirt. He went to one knee and then the floor, and Ellie caught him. She caught him by the front of his shirt, and she did not let him fall. She was 32 weeks pregnant, and she held a 200-pound man off the floor through nothing but refusal. Her knees hit the ground. His weight drove her down. She held. He looked up at her. His face was pale. His eyes were very clear. "Vivian," he said. Not desperate, not a plea. The way a person says the one word they are most certain of. "I'm here," she said. She didn't correct the name. Dr. Reyes arrived in 11 minutes. Ethan was stabilized and moved to the ground floor recovery room. Through and through wound. Serious but survivable. She worked fast and without talking. Then she came out to check on Ellie. Ellie was sitting on the hallway floor, her back against the wall, one hand pressed flat to her abdomen. Her face was white. Her breathing was short and controlled and very careful. She looked up at Reyes. "Something's happening," she said quietly. "Real contractions." Different from before, her water broke at 10:52 p.m. 32 weeks, too early. Reyes moved between two rooms. Ethan in the recovery room, pale and medicated, in and out. Ellie in the master suite with the medical kit, and 40 minutes until the birth team could arrive. Connor was running between them. The house that had been quiet for 5 weeks was full of wounded men and low, urgent voices and the sound of doors. Ellie was alone in the way that mattered most. She lay there and she thought, "This is it. This is the bottom of it." She was in premature labor in a house that had just been attacked, in a body she didn't fully recognize, with no memory of who she was. And the father of her child was bleeding in the next room. And the man who had tried to erase her 8 months ago was still somewhere she couldn't locate. There was no one to call who wasn't already in crisis. There was no door she could walk through. She was 32 weeks pregnant, and more alone than she had ever been in any life she could remember. Reyes came in between trips down the hall. She sat beside Ellie and looked at her directly. "Listen to me. You have survived things you don't remember surviving. Your body has been keeping this baby safe for 7 months on almost nothing. You know how to do this. Trust what your body knows." Ellie breathed. She focused on the breathing. She thought about June Hadley at the shelter, sitting across from her at a folding table with a bowl of soup and no agenda except to talk to her like she was someone. She thought about Dee in the alley with a foil-wrapped plate. She thought about small kindnesses and what they weighed and how much of her survival had been built on them. The contractions slowed, then spaced out, then steadied. Reyes at 1 in the morning. "She's staying. The baby is staying." The relief in the room was physical. Like the air had been holding itself and finally let go. Later, much later, when the house was quiet and Reyes was satisfied with both her patients. Ellie lay in the bed with her hand on her stomach, and the baby still inside her, and everything still. Finally, still. She asked Connor to move Ethan's chair into the room. They moved him in, pale and bandaged, half asleep from the medication. He was in the chair. She could hear him breathe. At 3 in the morning, she reached out and took his hand, the one that wasn't bandaged. She held it. She didn't decide to. It happened, and she let it. She held it until morning. Memory lives in the mind, but love is older than memory. It lives somewhere the blast couldn't reach. 3 days. That's how long it took for the house to find a new kind of quiet. Not the peace of the 5 weeks before. Something different. Harder one. The quiet after something breaks, and you look at the pieces and decide to stay in the room with them. Ethan's wound was serious but healing. He moved carefully, ate what Reyes told him to eat, slept when she told him to sleep. He didn't argue with her. That alone told Ellie something. She moved carefully too. The baby had settled. The contractions were gone. But everything felt closer to the surface now, like skin after a burn, tender in ways that weren't visible. She started noticing things she couldn't explain. She'd smell Ethan's coffee in the morning, before she heard him in the kitchen, and feel something settle in her chest. Not recognition exactly. More like a key turning in a lock she didn't know was there. She'd catch herself about to reach for his hand at dinner and pull back and sit with the strangeness of that impulse. She didn't tell him she had a dream. Jazz, the old kind, the kind from the record player. Someone laughing in it, a specific laugh. the kind that meant safety. And she knew that in the dream the way you know things in dreams, completely and without needing a reason. She woke up and Ethan was in the chair by the window, pale and bandaged and asleep. She lay there and felt like the dream hadn't ended yet. She didn't tell him that either. She was thinking about it 3 days later when Marcus arrived. He came in the afternoon, presenting it as a visit to a wounded friend. His timing was calculated. Ethan was at his most coherent in the mornings. By afternoon, the pain medication had taken the edge off his alertness and he looked, to anyone who didn't know him well, more impaired than he was. Marcus sat with him in the recovery room, warm and grieving and exactly right. Those Delacroix animals. I've been working every contact I have trying to find out who gave them the opening. When I find out, you'll what? Ethan said. His voice was tired. Handle it. The way we always do. Ellie was in the corner chair with a book. Marcus had glanced at her when he came in and dismissed her in the same motion. Pregnant woman, recovering from a scare, reading, background not relevant. That was his only mistake. And it was final. He settled into the visit, became comfortable, started to fill the space the way he always did when he believed he was the most capable person in the room, which was most of the time. The only good thing, he said, is that whoever tipped them off didn't give them the full layout. If they'd known about the back route through the garden wall, you'd have lost her in the first 2 minutes. The room was quiet. Ethan didn't move, didn't change expression. The garden wall route existed in 3 documents. The original estate blueprints in a legal vault, Connor's classified to security protocol files, and a memo Ethan had sent to his inner circle 3 weeks ago when he'd upgraded the perimeter system. Marcus was on that distribution list. Ellie turned a page. She didn't look up. She didn't change the pace of her reading. She sat in the corner and she was invisible and she filed away every word. After Marcus left, she found Connor in the hallway. I need a recorder small enough to fit in the base of the crystal decanter in the study, she said. Her voice was quiet and very steady. And a phone that isn't connected to this estate. Connor looked at her for a moment. Yes, ma'am, he said. One more thing. She handed him a folded piece of paper. I need you to arrange for this person to meet with me privately. Not through Ethan. Not through anyone on his payroll. Can you do that? He unfolded it. Read the name. Special Agent Dana Marsh. FBI New Orleans Field Office. He folded it again. He looked at her. I'll make the call, he said. That evening, Ethan was awake and in less pain. She sat across from him in the dim recovery room, and they were quiet together for a while, which was something they'd gotten good at. You called me Vivian, she said. When you were shot. I know. I didn't correct you. I noticed. She looked at her hands. Last night I had a dream. There was jazz. Someone's was laughing and I knew. In the dream that the laugh meant I was safe. I woke up and you were in the chair. She paused. I felt like the dream hadn't ended yet. He was quiet for a moment. Vivian used to say feeling things before the mind does. Do you believe that? I didn't used to. She sat with that. Then she said the thing she'd been working toward. What Marcus did and whoever helped him. They didn't just try to kill a woman. They tried to erase a person completely. Name, history. Right to exist, she stopped. And they almost succeeded. If Dee hadn't been at that door. If June Hadley at the shelter hadn't given me a meal and talked to me like I was worth talking to. When I was worth nothing to anyone with any power in this world. She stopped again. People's lives hang on whether strangers decide they're worth helping. And the world has a very short list of who qualifies. That is not separate from what Marcus did. It's the same belief at a different scale. The belief that some people matter less. That some people can be managed or moved or erased when they become inconvenient. Ethan didn't say anything. Dee saw me, June Hadley saw me. Dr. Ray sees me. Most of the world didn't. And that gap between who gets seen and who doesn't, that's not small. That's the whole thing. Connor appeared in the doorway. He was holding a flash drive. Full financial trail, he said, came in accounts. Pack routing, clinic payment. All of it. Timestamped and sourced. Ellie said, make 2 copies. Ethan looked at her, 2, one for you. One for the FBI. The room went very quiet. You're serious, Ethan said. Completely. She met his eyes and held them. What happens in this house is not enough. A man who decided a woman's life was worth less than his ambition needs to face something outside these walls. Something public, on record, with consequences that don't disappear. She didn't look away. That's not weakness. That's what accountability actually looks like. She still didn't know who she'd been. She knew exactly who she was. And she was done letting anyone else run the board. She worked with Connor for 2 days. She was systematic about it. She laid everything out on the small desk, in the corner of the master suite, like pieces of a case she was building, which is exactly what it was. The Lakeshore Drive conversation. Her notes from it, word for word. Marcus's comment about the garden wall route, the distribution list for the memo, the confirmation that he was on it. The Cayman financial trail Connor had pulled, Vivienne's journal, specifically the final entry. The one about watching what Ethan was becoming and who might be afraid of it. And one more piece, her own contribution, the one nobody else had thought to gather. She called Dee Crawford directly on Connor's untraceable phone and asked about the security camera at the Velvet Crown service entrance. Dee was quiet for a second. Then, how'd you know about that? I guessed, Ellie said. You're too careful not to have one. Dee had 6 months of footage. Marcus Webb appeared in it 11 times. He came through the service entrance. Not the front for meetings that didn't appear on any schedule Ethan had kept. 11 meetings, no record of any of them. Ellie wrote it all down, organized it, set it in order. Then she picked up the phone and called Agent Dana Marsh. Marsh answered on the second ring. My name is Vivian Cole Blackwood, Ellie said. I'm going to tell you something complicated, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. She paused. I have physical evidence, financial documentation, security footage, a written record left by the victim before the crime, and a recorded confession I intend to obtain. I'm making this call of my own free will, my own decision, not at anyone's direction. She paused again. My situation is complicated, and I need you to understand that I am the author of this. Not Ethan Blackwood. Me. Marsh was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, Mrs. Blackwood. I've been building toward this for 3 years. Then you have 60% of it already. Ellie said, I have the rest. FBI preparation took 2 weeks. Warrants obtained. Agents placed. Parameters set. Marsh was thorough and she was fast and she didn't need to be told twice about anything. Ellie respected that. She told Connor what she was doing with Ethan's case as well. Marcus chose to believe that a woman hunting her husband toward something better was a threat to be removed, she said. He looked at her and saw a liability. Not a person with something worth hearing. Not someone with a clearer view than he had. Just an obstacle. She folded her hands on the desk. That belief is not rare. It lives everywhere in smaller forms. In men who talk over women in meetings. In decisions made about women's lives without asking them. In all the quiet ways people get made invisible before anyone needs to do anything dramatic about it. Marcus took it as far as it goes. But the logic started somewhere ordinary. Connor and Ethan. Ethan has his own accounting to face. He's not innocent, but he didn't try to erase her. He mourned her. He fell up. He's been trying badly and slowly to put himself back together differently. She looked at Connor. That's not the same crime. It's a different conversation. Ethan recovered enough to sit at his desk and hold a meeting. Didn't know the full scope of what Ellie had arranged until the morning Marcus was due to arrive. She told him enough. The recorder, the FBI in the kitchen, the plan. He looked at her for a long time. You did all of this, he said. Yes, while you were recovering from early labor and living in my house and not knowing who you were. I had a lot of time to think, she said. He looked at the desk, then back at her. There was something in his face she was starting to be able to read. Not well yet. Okay, he said. Tell me what I need to do. Marcus came through the front door at 2 o'clock with his portfolio and his easy confidence and the manner of a man who considered himself the most capable person in any room he entered. Connor had swept the study. The recorder sat in the base of the crystal decanter. The one Marcus poured from every single visit without being offered. Agent Marsh and 2 FBI agents were in the kitchen. They had been there for 40 minutes. Marcus sat down, poured his scotch. He was comfortable. He thought he was managing a recovering friend who was more dependent on him than ever. 10 minutes in, he picked up the decanter to pour a second glass. He set it down slowly. He looked at it. Then at Ethan, he tilted his head slightly. He'd noticed the weight was off. Something in the base, he knew. He recalculated in about 4 seconds. And he decided that his best play, the play of a man who genuinely believed in his own logic, was to lean all the way in. He couldn't be prosecuted by Ethan's version of justice. He'd decided long ago that Ethan would never have the stomach to go through with it. He was going to give Ethan the confession of a man who believed he was untouchable. He looked at Ethan and his voice lost the warmth. Just dropped it. Like setting down a coat. She was making you soft. Ethan didn't move. She had you looking at legal transitions, legitimate operations. You were going to hand over everything we built because she had a 5-year plan on a legal pad, and you thought that was love. Marcus leaned back. You're going to walk away from the port contracts. From 20 years, from everything your family bled for. Because she asked you nicely enough. So you tried to kill my wife. I tried to save what we built. She was the only thing worth saving, Ethan said. His voice was very quiet. She was the only thing in any of this that was actually worth anything, and you knew that. And you did it anyway. She survived no thanks to you. Marcus reached for his weapon. Connor was in the doorway before the hand completed the motion. 2 men stepped out of the adjoining room. Marcus was disarmed, efficiently and without drama. He stood there and looked at Ethan, then at Connor, then his eyes moved to the doorway behind him. Ellie was standing in it. She had been there since the moment Marcus said she was making you soft. The recorder had what it needed before Marcus knew it was running. She'd heard every word. You did this, Marcus said. I did, she said, and I'd do it exactly the same way again. Agent Dana Marsh stepped in from the hallway, 2 agents behind her. Marcus Webb, you're under arrest. For the first time in everything. The mask came off, not all at once, just a flicker. A moment of something unmanaged and genuine in his eyes before the control came back. He had not expected the FBI. He'd expected Ethan's version of justice, which he'd survived before and believed he could survive again. He had not accounted for a woman with no name and no memory and no power, who had spent 2 weeks building a federal case from a corner of a recovery room. He looked at Ellie one more time. She looked back at him calmly. Senator Harlow's office was raided 48 hours later. The Pack connection held. The Cayman Trail closed itself. The U.S. Attorney described the case as comprehensive and airtight, which was exactly what it was. Marcus Webb was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, financial fraud, and federal racketeering. He would not be getting out. Ethan and Ellie sat in the garden the morning after. The light was different, the way light is after something heavy has been lifted. Everything a little clearer, a little more itself. What happens now, she said. With us, with you, with all of it. He held the printout of Vivian's last journal entry. He'd read it enough times to have it memorized, but he still held it. She wrote, "Start with the people who were afraid of what Ethan was becoming. Not what he is, what he was becoming." He looked up. I want to be the person she was afraid of. Not afraid of like a threat. Afraid of like a hope. Ellie looked at him for a moment. That's a start, she said, Doctor. Reyes came through the garden door. She looked at Ellie, and her professional expression had something warm underneath it. It's time, she said. She had come into the world of her second life without a name. She had rebuilt herself from silence and borrowed time, and the small specific kindnesses of people who had nothing to gain from being kind. And now, in a room with jazz on the record player and the right kind of hand to hold, she was about to finish becoming herself. 38 weeks, full term. The master suite was warm. Dr. Reyes had everything she needed. The Louis Armstrong record was on the player. The same one from the sitting room the night Ellie fell asleep in the chair, and it was Ethan's choice, unexplained. She'd noticed and said nothing. He held her hand from the beginning, and he didn't let go. The birth was long, it was real and hard, and nothing about it was soft or easy or cinematic. Ellie was completely present through all of it, ferocious and focused, making Reyes laugh twice with things she said under her breath, and telling Ethan at one point to stop looking at her like a building was falling down. She was fine. She could see his face from here, and he needed to adjust it. He adjusted it in the last minutes, in the particular altered state of labor, where the body takes over, and the mind becomes a passenger. Ellie said something, clearly and calmly, in a voice that was steadier than it had any right to be. Put the music on. She should come in with music. The record was already playing. Ethan went completely still. He knew those words. He knew them because Vivian had said them once, early in their marriage, late at night. Talking about the future the way people do, when the future still feels like something you can shape however you want. If we ever have a baby, I want there to be music when they arrive. A midnight conversation, just the 2 of them. No one else ever knew she'd said it. He'd put the record on before she asked. Ellie didn't know she'd said it. The moment passed through her and she didn't hold it. But Ethan held it. He was going to carry it for the rest of his life, quietly, the way you carry the best things. At 4:47 in the morning, a girl, strong, indignant, announcing herself at full volume, which surprised no one who would come to know her. Ethan came apart all at once. The way a structure comes down when the weight finally exceeds what it was built to hold. He leaned his forehead against Ellie's hand and cried without making a sound. She felt the tears on her skin, and something in her body knew this feeling, not from memory, from somewhere deeper and older than memory, somewhere Marcus Webb's plan had never been able to reach. Reyes placed the baby on her chest. Dark hair, Ethan's, Vivian's expressions already, even in her first red-faced, indignant minutes. A new person made of impossible things. "Hello," Ellie whispered. The baby opened her eyes and looked at her like she already had opinions. "What do we call her?" Ethan said. His voice was completely unrecognizable from the man in the bar 8 months ago. Completely unrecognizable from anything. Ellie studied her daughter's face, the nose, the chin, the specific curl of her left fist. "June," she said, "June. She worked at St. Anne's when I first got there. She sat across from me at a folding table, with a bowl of soup and no agenda except to talk to me like I was worth talking to. When I was worth nothing to anyone with any resources or any power." She paused. "She died 4 months ago. Cardiac event. I never got to tell her what that conversation meant." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "June Cole Blackwood. Cole is mine. Whatever I remember and whatever I don't. That name is mine, and she carries it." "June Cole Blackwood," Ethan said. He looked at his daughter, then at Ellie. "Yeah, that's right." Dee Crawford appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later. She stood there with tears running freely and no apology for any of them. "Lord have mercy," she said. "Just look at her." Connor came to the doorway behind Dee, looked at the baby, and had the expression of a man who had been very hard for a very long time and was, for this specific moment, something else entirely. He excused himself to the hallway. Nobody mentioned it. Reyes stayed longer than she needed to. Checking vitals she'd already confirmed were fine. Then it was just them, Ethan and Ellie and June. "I still don't have the memories," Ellie said. She was exhausted and very clear. The particular clarity that comes after something enormous. "I don't know when they'll come back. I don't know what comes back and what doesn't. I can't promise you, Vivienne. I know, but I know you." She looked at him. "I know who you've been these past weeks. I know you put down the bottle without being asked and without making it a story. I know you unlocked the door the second I pointed at it. I know you read me 12 chapters of a book about Flemish painters at 11 at night because I was too tired to hold it and you didn't want to stop." She looked down at June and back at him. "I know you took a bullet and your first word was my name." He was very still. "I don't know if I love you," she said. "I can't say that yet, but I want to find out. And I think that wanting is worth something." The first clean breath. The first full, real unguarded breath Ethan Blackwood had drawn in 8 months. "It's everything," he said. In the morning, Ellie stood at the window with June sleeping in the carrier against her chest, New Orleans light coming through. Ethan stood behind her, not too close. "Present. I've talked to a real lawyer," he said, "not one of ours. About what a legal exit from the operation actually looks like. What it costs, what I owe." He paused. "It's years, not months. Some of it I'll answer for." She turned. "I know I will." He said, "I'm not trying to avoid it. I'm trying to make sure it's the last category of thing I answer for." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said the thing she'd been building toward since the night in the bar when she was on the floor and had nothing and said it anyway. "What was done to me was not just a crime against one person. It was a belief that a woman's life could be placed on one side of a scale and a business concern on the other, and the woman could lose." She looked at June. "That belief doesn't start with a car bomb. It starts earlier, much earlier. It starts with the men who don't listen. The rooms women aren't included in. The decisions made about their lives without asking them. The way people get made invisible when they're inconvenient, quietly, over time, until they start to believe they are invisible." She looked back at Ethan. "Marcus took that belief as far as it goes. But the logic underneath it is ordinary. It's everywhere. And the only difference between what he did and 100 smaller versions of the same thing is how far someone was willing to go." She looked at June again. "So when I say I want to find out if I love you, part of what I'm finding out is whether you are someone who will spend the rest of his life understanding that. Not just for me, for anyone whose life your world has ever touched." "That's a high bar," he said. A pause. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to clear it." She turned back to the window. Then let's see, 1 week later, early morning, the garden. Ellie alone with June in the carrier. Dee on the porch steps with coffee. The particular New Orleans light that comes before the heat. Magnolia and river on the air. The roses she had deadheaded weeks ago had bloomed. She hadn't planned them. Her hands had just known. She took out a blank card. She'd been writing to herself, keeping her own record the way Vivian had kept hers. She wrote, "My name is Vivian Cole Blackwood. I was told this for weeks before I believed it. I believe it now, not because the memories returned, but because I chose it. Identity is not only what you carry from before. It is what you build from what is left. I don't know who I was. I know who I am. I am the woman who survived a bombing and a kidnapping and 8 months of being nobody. I am the woman who set terms in a room full of men who had every advantage and held to them. I am the woman who decided that justice meant witnesses and public record and real consequences, not just a closed door. I am the woman who named her daughter for someone who was kind to a stranger for no reason and expected nothing back. I am the woman who had a daughter in a room with jazz music and the right kind of hand to hold. And I am the woman who is choosing, today, right now, of her own free will, to find out what comes next." She closed the card. June made a small sound, not unhappy, just present, announcing herself again, quietly this time. Vivian looked down at her. "Good morning, June Cole Blackwood." She walked into the garden. The roses were open. The light was coming through the live oak trees the way it did on the good mornings. Clean and angled and full of something that felt, cautiously, like possibility. The door behind her stayed open. She left it that way. In the end, this was never just a story about a missing woman, a powerful man, or a betrayal hidden behind wealth and loyalty. It was a story about what happens when truth is buried so deeply that even identity itself becomes uncertain. When a person is erased not only from records, but from their own mind, the question is no longer simply who are you, but who gets to decide that answer. Vivian's journey was never only about memory returning. It was about something far more powerful, the ability to rebuild a self from fragments, silence, and survival. Even without her past, she still made choices. She still set boundaries. She still protected a life growing inside her. And in doing so, she proved something that memory alone could never define. Identity is not only what you remember, but what you choose to become when nothing is left to guide you. Ethan Blackwood's path was equally resourcing in its own way. A man built on control, power, and calculated silence was forced to confront the one thing he could never negotiate with: loss. And in that loss, he discovered something he had long forgotten: vulnerability is not weakness, but the beginning of responsibility. Real strength is not the ability to dominate a room, but the ability to change when the truth demands it. Marcus Webb represents something darker, something more ordinary and therefore more dangerous. He is not a monster born from chaos, but a man shaped by belief that power justifies erasure, that outcomes matter more than people, and that control is always worth the cost. His downfall was not just justice served, it was the exposure of a mindset that exists far beyond one man, in systems, decisions, and silences repeated everywhere. But perhaps the deepest truth of this story lies not in betrayal or revenge, but in recognition. Vivian was seen when she had no name. She was believed when she had no history. And in the most critical moments, it was not power that saved her, it was attention. The willingness of a few people to notice what others ignored. Dee Crawford, June Hadley, Dr. Reyes. Small acts, quiet decisions, invisible kindnesses that became the difference between disappearance and survival. That is the lesson this story leaves behind. People are not erased in a single moment. They are erased slowly when the world stops looking. And they are saved the same way, not by grand gestures, but by those who refuse to look away. Justice in this world was not just punishment. It was restoration. Not everything was returned. Not every memory came back. Not every wound fully healed. But something more important was rebuilt: agency. The right to choose. The right to speak. The right to exist without permission. And in the quiet aftermath, with a child now holding the future in her hands, one truth remains above all others. Even when memory fails, even when identity is taken, Even when power tries to rewrite your story, what cannot be erased is the human will to become whole again. Because in the end, no matter how dark the world becomes, survival is not the end of the story. It is where the story begins again. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.